Bom dia a todos e todas que nos assistem agora. Hoje o Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet terá como foco de debate os desafios colocados em torno do avanço da infraestrutura da internet, seus recursos críticos, protocolos, que podem trazer tanto implicações técnicas quanto políticas para o avanço da rede. Dessa forma, essa atividade DGI busca contribuir com o próprio avanço do debate sobre a governança da internet e os seus novos desafios. Nós gostaríamos, antes de tudo, agradecer a presença da Fiona Alexander e do Barry Leiba, que aceitaram o convite para esse debate tão atual, e principalmente do Christian O'Flaherty, que vai moderar esse debate. O Christian, ele atua na Internet Society desde 2009, hoje ocupa o cargo de vice-presidente regional para a América Latina e o Caribe, é graduado em Ciência da Computação e pós-graduado em Gestão Empresarial, e iniciou sua carreira na academia como diretor de operações da Rede Nacional de Pesquisa e Educação da Argentina. De 1997 a 2006, atuou como gerente de produtos de internet na Global Crossing Latin America e trabalhou na implementação e desenvolvimento de negócios para a empresa. Ele foi presidente também do Fórum de Políticas Públicas do LACNIC e membro fundador de algumas organizações regionais, como o Grupo de Operadores da Rede da América Latina e do Caribe, a LECNOG, e a Argentina IXP, entre outras. Christian, muito obrigada por aceitar o nosso convite. É um grande prazer tê-lo aqui conosco para moderar esse debate, e a gente deseja a vocês uma ótima discussão. Eu gostaria de lembrar antes que o chat está aberto para a participação do público, e a gente está com 4 canais sendo transmitidos no YouTube, em espanhol, em português e no áudio original. Boa discussão para vocês, Christian.
Muito obrigado. Prazer. Vou falar em inglês, so I'm going to switch to English. And the panel is going to take place in English, so please check the interpretation on your channels. So let me introduce first our panelists and the topics. This is the second panel on the core theme 2. Our panelists for this topic are going to be Fiona Alexander. She's the co-founder of SaltPoint Strategies and also a presidential rank award winner for her leadership at the U.S. Department of Commerce, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTAA. So for many of you, this acronym is going to be very familiar. So she's an internet expert. She's expert in cyber and communications policy, and also serves as distinguished policy strategist in residence in the School of International Service and distinguished fellow Internet Governance Lab at American University. She's a member of the high-level advisory group for the Global Internet Jurisdiction Policy Network and a former member of the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. And our second panelist is going to be Barry Leiba. He has been a director of Internet standards at Featherway Technologies since 2009. And before that, he was a senior technical staff member at IBM in the research division. He has worked on email and related technologies since the early 80s. And currently he's focusing on Internet of Things, blockchain technology, security, privacy of Internet applications, and Internet standards development and deployment. Barry has been very active in the ATF. We all know him and his name from the ATF since the mid-90s. And he's the author of several RCs and proposed standards. He's currently a member of ICANN, Security and Stability Advisory Committee, the SSAC. Many of you already heard about this acronym as well. And is an associate editor-in-chief of IEEE Internet Computer Magazine. So as I mentioned before, this is the second panel on the core theme 2, on infrastructure, technical and critical resources, protocols. We'll also try to cover issues on international disputes, mostly over the definition of those rules, norms, and principles, standards and protocols that are required for the internet to work properly. And also this quest for a unique, secure, and resilient internet that we all want. Also, topics included by the panelists are going to be aligned on the lines of technical and political discussions that also are on the edge or limits of the current discussion arrangements, and also to think about this utopia or global value that the internet have, and if it's possible to keep it as it is. The topics themselves are going to be broad, and we encourage all of you to ask also in topics that might not be in this list. So like future technologies like 5G, and also consequences of the usage of those technologies on net neutrality or other issues, also about geopolitical controversies or the benefits or not on proposals such as the new IP proposals or any other proposal that might be a concern for the current internet. And also any other issues that can involve the development or technical development of the network. So with that introduction, let's start with Barry and his views about those topics and in general, and we will let you ask questions later on. So Barry?
Hi, so I'm Barry Liba. I want to start by saying that I work for FutureWay. I work in the IETF and other standards organizations. I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm speaking my own opinion and not on behalf of my employer or any of the SDOs that I work in. So I guess for opening comments, the summary I was given of things starts talking about fragmentation of the internet. So I wanted to start with that topic. And we've already had fragmentation of the internet in a number of ways. Social media platforms have fragmented the internet, arguably, by drawing content into their applications and providing services that are only available in their networks. If you want to follow someone's Facebook posts, for example, you have to use Facebook. And their model for what they do is that everything is there in Facebook in preference to linking to outside content. So you post comments there, you post videos there, and it's only available to people who are part of that network. And with the growth of social networks, there's ever increasing fragmentation between what's inside that bubble and the rest of the internet. We have a similar effect with entertainment networks, arguably doing the same thing with licensed entertainment content. You stream this content from one provider and that content from another provider, and each provider's goal is to keep you within their piece of the network, within their content network, separating it out from the rest of the internet. Traditional content providers in the US, we've had ABC, CBS, and NBC are three major content networks in the US from the early days of television and even radio. They've gotten onto that as well on the internet. CBS, for example, has introduced a number of TV programs by providing the first episode freely, the way they always have, but then requiring a subscription to CBS All Access in order to see the rest of it. So you have that kind of content fragmentation. So from a country point of view, it's kind of not surprising that some countries want to control the boundaries of their internet in somewhat the way they control the physical boundaries of their countries. I'm not judging whether any of what I've said is good or bad, but just saying that it's an inevitable aspect of integrating the internet into our lives. The more we connect this technology to what we do from day to day, the more we take what we have always done from day to day and move it into the internet, and that includes limitations as well as broadening and openness. So with respect to limiting internet access, even the US has done a small bit of limiting internet access from country to country as well, with what we call the Clean Network program that was started a couple of years ago. with guidelines that attempt to block applications and services from certain countries that we consider to be national threats, and to avoid routing data in certain ways that might make it vulnerable to exposure or attack from those countries. So I think these sort of actions do threaten the stability and openness of the internet. But as I said, it's not surprising that countries are moving in these sorts of directions. And it's really inevitable. So we have to look at how the internet's resilience can overcome that. But governments have a long history of not trusting each other fully. The limits to that trust always lead to various restrictions, trade restrictions, travel restrictions, tariffs, and so on. So restricting internet communication is another manifestation of those limits on trust. I wanted to talk a little bit about network neutrality here, and I think it ties into that pretty well. It's a difficult topic. Network neutrality has a lot of aspects that aren't just black and white, not straightforward, no clear answers. We say we want a fully open and neutral internet without censorship, without blocking. And yet we do want to block criminal activity. And we do want to censor things such as child abuse material and some kinds of pornography. And all of that brings up issues of how we look at things as a society, how what is unacceptable violation of freedom to one person or one group is important protection to another person or another group. Zero rating is an aspect of that too. Network neutrality says we have to carry data from, say, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu all equally. Saying you have to pay your carrier to stream Netflix, but Hulu comes for free is not neutral. But does that mean it's not acceptable to say that video streaming, say, from any provider is zero cost, even if you have data limits for other types of data? T-Mobile, I have T-Mobile for my cell phone, for my mobile phone. Their plan allows me to do all audio and video streaming without any charge, without regard to where the content is coming from. So that seems neutral at one level. And what I pay for that is allowing T-Mobile to reduce the bandwidth and therefore the quality of the stream, so it has less effect on their network. For them, it's a network management issue. Now, I like that feature. But is that still neutral? Or does the fact that video streaming is free, but data from Facebook is not free, does that violate neutrality? That's an open question. So not straightforward, not easy. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was new IP. And I'll start by saying, I think the name is unfortunate. It was named in a marketing kind of way, something to make a splash, something to sound bold. But when we talk about new IP, it gives the impression that the idea is to redesign the basic internet protocol from the ground up and build a new internet. So that's not how I look at what the project is meant to be, from what I've read, from what I've analyzed. So in looking at it and its connection to ITUT, I think it's important to keep in mind the broader concept that's involved. The point is to bring up ideas about future internet applications, future use cases that might pose challenges as they're implemented, that might stress the internet as we have now. Look at what new requirements they bring, those use cases bring, where the requirements stress the internet we have, and then look at the protocols that run the internet and do a gap analysis. What are the things that are missing from those protocols that those requirements highlight? Where do we need to enhance or extend existing protocols? Where might we need new protocols to fill in the gaps? And where, maybe in some cases, we do need to do some redesign. All in an analysis level. Do that. After the gap analysis, then it's time to make specific protocol proposals, and those proposals go to the relevant standards organizations. So in the case of internet protocol related stuff and routing protocols, that goes to the IETF. So I think the reason that conversation started in ITUT is partly due to where the issues were raised in the early discussions and where those people were used to participating, and partly due to the fact that the IETF doesn't work at its best in looking at broad concepts. It works best at dealing with specific proposals for protocols and smaller pieces. So that's not to say that the IETF doesn't keep broad concepts in mind while they're doing the work. But for example, rather than working on IoT, the IETF has worked on a number of protocols in working groups, such as CORE for a data transfer protocol, which is called COAP, ROLL for routing protocols, ACE for authentication protocols, and a good number of other areas within the IETF. All of these are pieces of the IoT concept, but it's not being called IoT work in the IETF. As we work on it, we keep the whole IoT concept in mind. So the same is going to apply to new IP. As these gaps are raised within the IETF and proposals are made to fill the gaps, they will tie together. I think that's all I wanted to say as introductory comments, so I'll turn it over back to Christian.
Thank you very much, and I've got myself several questions for you, but let's proceed with Fiona's comments and positions, and then we will open the floor for questions, and we will for sure have many follow-up topics to discuss. So Fiona, the floor is yours.
Sure. Hello and good morning for those of us on the sort of eastern coast of this hemisphere. Nice to see everybody, and thank you again for the invitation to participate in today's conversation. Similar to Barry, I'll do my disclaimer about who I'm speaking for. So for some folks that are watching or they're participating, they may know me from my time at NTIA. So I did work for the US government for about 20 years and across 4 administrations. So I'm happy to give some context to some positions that were taken over the years, but obviously my comments are not speaking for the current administration or the US government, nor am I speaking for any clients that we may have that work in this area, but just kind of sharing some observations and reflections. So with that, we'll kind of get going. I will also warn that I notoriously speak very quickly, so I will do my best to not do so fast given the translation, but if for some reason someone needs to interrupt me, please feel free to do so. I'm quite used to that. So the topics and the questions that were sent and put for today's panel, what are the opportunities, risks, and barriers for the global implementation of new network technologies? And I sort of stopped and I thought a lot about like what might be useful to cover today. And I think it goes with, we often forget about talking about the opportunities of technology, right? We like to focus on what are the challenges and what are the problems we need to address and fix without actually first talking about the opportunities. So I just wanted to quickly touch on what that looks like, right? So obviously there's a huge market for technology. There's a huge market for the internet and broadband and all the things that come with it. That has always been the case. But I think as we all head into the second year of this global pandemic of COVID-19, it's only more enhanced how important it is for us to be connected and to be online. And the digital divide, a topic that I've known for many years. And when I was actually an intern at NTIA, when I was in college at American University, and the concepts of digital divide first sort of surfaced globally, and going back, I think, to the Maitland Commission report prior to that, have never been more important. So you've got a topic that the world has known for 30 years is critical, and the importance of being interconnected and being online is even more important than it used to be. So globally, only, I think UNESCO says only half of households have an internet connection. So we've made some progress. We still have 45% of the world, if not a little bit more, that's not connected. Here in the United States, we have 7% of the country that doesn't have internet access. There's lots of different reasons for that. But even here in our country, I think Australia had 13% that wasn't connected. So some challenges, not just in sort of developing world or least developed world, but in the developed world where you would expect better connectivity. But half of the world's population doesn't have access. Fewer than 1 in 5 people in the least developed countries are connected. And then, of course, the digital divide impacts women more than men. So we also have a gender divide issue to sort of deal with. Here in the United States, for anyone that's following the news of the day, the Biden administration has proposed a big infrastructure package last week of $2 trillion. I'm not even sure what $1 trillion is. It's such a big number, but $2 trillion to look and invest in what it calls infrastructure across the country. In that package, $100 billion is proposed for broadband. And for the first time from a sitting White House, the administration is looking at broadband as more of a basic, I don't want to call it a human right, but a basic infrastructure, and much more of like a rural electric issue, right? As opposed to what has been looked at in the past. So this is a big shift in the United States in terms of a conversation about broadband and the importance of broadband. So that's what's happening here. So obviously opportunities abound for technology, including new technologies, both locally in your home market, but globally. But so what are the risks and barriers to getting this technology out? And I will just offer, given that my 20 years of work on these issues has been heavily focused on and being part of the geopolitical debate of the technical infrastructure, it's interesting to me that more and more geopolitics is sort of seeping its way into all of our technical conversations. It used to be a very niche conversation where only people that went to ITU, not everybody in the world knew what ITU was or knew what IETF was. Now more and more people are aware of the institutions and the standards that are involved. And those standards and the rules around the system are being used as a geopolitical tool to actually deal with government issues. So what are the risks and barriers? I just want to briefly talk about 4 and as we get into our conversation. So the first risk or barrier that I see is the development of interoperable agreed standards. And this a little bit touches on what Barry was covering. The internet was developed and the different protocols that make up the internet were developed with the idea of, open, participatory, collaboration, no single point of control. And this is very much antithetical to how when governments make choices, regardless of where you live in the world. Governments usually are the decision makers. And so the internet of today was developed in a system completely opposite to that construct. Good or bad. And what that's led to, though, is in today's pandemic world, at least here in the United States, the internet was able to scale, right? The internet, I think at one point they were saying last year, peak traffic was up by 1/3 in the United States, with some areas reaching as high as 60% above normal capacity or requests because we're all working at home. And the open collaborative nature of the network here, at least as deployed in the US, was able to scale and take care of that. Now, there have been proposals, as Barry has referenced, to develop new standards or new IP. I agree the branding was probably not the best, but how to evolve the network and where to go. And there's definitely some puts and takes, some pros and cons about where's the right place to develop internet standards, what's the right approach for developing them, and who's the decision maker in that process, whether it's an open participatory bottom-up process like the IETF, or more of a intergovernmental forum like the ITU. So again, just where you push your standards and where you propose your standards can have a geopolitical context on these issues these days. A second sort of issue that I see as sort of a category of risks and barriers to new technologies is the access to necessary resources and how to secure those. So in this bucket of issues, you could talk about radio frequency spectrum. If we're talking about 5G and new technologies, spectrum is one of the few things in the world that can't be created or destroyed. It can only be reappropriated, and spectrum is pretty encumbered in most places. So there's commercial challenges between wireless carriers and non-wireless carriers. There's challenges of allocations between government agencies and commercial uses. So that's sort of a point of contention and sort of can be a risk or a barrier depending on where you are. The other issue in terms of new technologies is your supply chain. And this is a big topic here in the United States, I know for sure, about how to secure the supply chain and sort of focusing very clearly on where technology resources come from, and if the country of origin has a particular agenda, and we can debate the pros and cons of that, but definitely a topic that's preoccupied the past administration and the current one as well. I mean, I think the United States is pretty unified in its approach in terms of concerns about security of the supply chain. Same thing with rare earth minerals. I think in our space, in internet governance world, we haven't talked about the rare earth mineral debate all that much, but it's very similar to the internet governance debate and something that folks might want to take a look at if they're looking at future topics. Another risk barrier topic I sort of think is worth discussing is how governments make choices and what those choices are at the national level. Here in the United States, historically, we tend to develop technology rules in an ex post way, which means we develop rules and norms and regulations after something has been rolled out and after a problem has been proven. There's that famous quote, that Silicon Valley quote, move fast and break things. It's very much an American perspective on how the world works, but it's lent itself to what's called ex post regulation, which means, again, lawmakers here in Washington, D.C. tend to look at a problem once it's happened and then make choices. Most of the world does not follow that approach in terms of how they develop rules and norms and standards. A technology is developed or things start to get discussed. A government or a society will have a conversation, and they might preemptively try to set guardrails around that to prevent harm. So different philosophical approaches depending on the culture of your country, but that too can impact technology and how things are deployed. As an example of that, net neutrality, first of all, means different things to different people. That's part of the challenge with that. It's not a single term. Here in the United States, there's pretty broad, or had been pretty broad agreement on the principles of net neutrality, no throttling, no blocking, no discrimination, those kinds of issues. We currently don't have regulated net neutrality in the sense that other countries do. I will also offer that here in the United States, the debate was very nuanced. It wasn't about whether we should have net neutrality, but how net neutrality should be enforced, whether it should be ex ante ahead of time, like other countries, which would be our federal communications regulator, who's our telecom specific regulator, or whether the enforcement of net neutrality would be ex post through our Federal Trade Commission, so our consumer protection regulator. But again, on this particular issue, if you have very strict net neutrality rules and you're enforcing them and abiding by them, letter of the law, I'm not an engineer like Barry. I would focus on the policy and regulatory things. And as a government regulator, you'd want to make sure people are complying with the law. In a lot of countries that have adopted net neutrality, if you're enforcing what's there, you can't have network slicing, which is kind of a big thing for 5G in terms of all the benefits that go. So pros and cons and trade-offs of trying to prescribe rules prior to technology's development, and then having to go back and assess if there's a negative impact or not. So the impact of net neutrality potentially in 5G and network slicing could be a challenge in certain parts of the world. And then the last topic is also, I think, one that Barry talked about in terms of fragmentation. And this is sort of what the policy regulatory conversation is at the global level. The internet respects no national borders. Technology and data is built to flow. Governments have to proactively go in and put in walls if they would like to stop that from happening. And then the cost of doing so in terms of economics and free expression and just general innovation can be damaging for a country. So, again, if you're looking to develop a new technology or if you're looking to evolve the current infrastructure, you have to kind of consider what those dynamics are at the policy at the global level as well. So I'll sort of stop with that and look forward to the conversation and some good questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. So now I invite the audience to ask questions. And in the meantime, I have a couple of questions for each of you. So I'm going to start with Barry, and also connected to things that Fiona also mentioned on fragmentation and these issues that are also geopolitical. And don't you think, Barry, that there is a role for those working on protocol development, trying to prevent the the opportunities from those that are trying to fragment the service itself. Like, for example, you've mentioned that we already have fragmentation in things like social networks or entertainment. This is a fact, and those huge companies are benefiting from that. But at the same time, there are things in the infrastructure, in the protocols, that can make their job easier when they try to create those silos, or for governments when they try to restrict access or routing ideas that they might have. So isn't there a role for those working on the protocols to try to prevent those things, at least to be more difficult to implement?
Yes, and we have been doing that. We have been looking at, well, for example, the IETF came out several years ago with an informational document giving the opinion of the IETF that pervasive monitoring is an attack, is the title of the document. And what that means is, excuse me, what that means is that the pervasive monitoring of internet traffic is indistinguishable from an attack on the internet, and therefore we have to treat it as an attack on the internet. If good actors can monitor what we're doing, then bad actors can monitor it too, and use that information to attack the internet or attack entities on the internet. So the IETF has responded to that by putting increasing levels of encryption in and various security protocols, and making other protocols more robust against modification and monitoring. So yes, we continue to look at those sorts of issues and come up with ways of making the protocols more robust to make the internet more secure, stable, and resilient. That said, there are limits to what we can do and still allow the protocols to operate flexibly. So there's a balance. And anything we push on, as Fiona mentioned, unintended consequences of various things. We're always concerned about that. As we make changes in one area, that may cause unintended consequences on another area, some restrictions on what we can do that we hadn't meant to, or even opening up channels for abuse that we hadn't thought about. So it's a delicate balance of getting the protocols right, and still allowing everything to operate the way we want it to, but not allow it to be abused. I think I'll stop there and let Fiona pick that up.
So before I give the floor to Fiona, if you want to go deeper in this topic of the influence of the protocols, you mentioned that there are discussions in several organizations, standard development organizations. You mentioned ITT or ITF or others, and they do have very different decision-making processes. In some of them, some stakeholders do have a strong influence compared to other SDOs. So do you foresee or what trend do you see in those processes? Is there going to be a winner and someone it's going to have the monopoly on those decisions that are affecting the network and protocol development? Or are there going to be new models on those processes, new organizations or coordination among them? Do you see a trend on those discussions? And you can also include if you would like to add something to what Barry has just said, also go ahead.
Sure. I think the conversation about new IP and or whatever it's called now, I think it's been renamed, and how to evolve the network and where the right place is to take it, whether you have the conversation in the ITU or whether you have it in IETF or somewhere else. This is not a new conversation, right? Barry's been doing this longer than I have, so maybe he can give some war stories of the earlier days, but even the standards for email, right? There was a debate about X25. I can hear Richard Hill in my head and other people from years ago. So this is not a new conversation about where's the best place to develop the standard. I will say that from my experience and my perspective, one of the things that makes the standards developed by the IETF more powerful is that it's voluntary, it's open, it's bottom up, and then companies make choices on what to deploy and how to deploy them. The ITU environment often will take a standard developed somewhere else and will agree with it, and that gives it legitimacy in some parts of the world. And in other topics like radio frequency spectrum, the ITU is the only place to actually allocate spectrum at a whole global level. So it has a unique role and there's no other place to do it. I think the standardization sector has a little bit of a harder position in the world because there are so many other places to develop technology standards, whether it's 3GPP or other places and IETF. It's not just ITUT. At the end of the day, the ITU is an intergovernmental organization. It's not a bad thing. It's the fact. It's a matter of fact, right? The ITU is almost 160 years old. It predates the UN by about 85 years. It was the International Telegraph Union at the outset, and it's based on a set of treaties. And at the end of the day, governments are the final decision maker in that construct and in the rules of procedure and in the treaty. I think the standardization sector over the years has done a lot to evolve its decision making. Many years ago, when I first got involved, they developed something called the alternative approval process, or the AAP, versus the traditional approval process. And this was the idea that you would take something that was truly technical, but didn't have a political or policy overlay, and it could be developed through a much faster standardization process, whereby the companies that participate in the ITU, and I should have said that the ITU is truly unique in the UN system in that it has, 800 sector members or companies that participate in the institution. And at these study group level, can have an equal, if not more, influence in a government as they're working through the issues. But what always makes it different than an IETF or a 3GPP or something else is that at the end of the day, a single government can come into the conversation and say, you know what, there's a policy issue here. We're going to throw up a red flag. We're going to say this has to go through TAP or the traditional approval process. And that means governments have to have a say. That slows down the process. And that means governments can stop it or block it or do whatever they want to the standard. Do I see that changing? No. Do I think it needs to? No, because I think the ITU is intergovernmental in nature. And I think each of these institutions have their place and have their role. And I think it's fine to have that conversation. I'm not sure, I haven't participated in IETF to the extent that Barry or Christian, you have. So I'm not sure if comparatively the ITU is a better place to have a more holistic conversation, as Barry suggested. I do think that the IETF tends to surface issues based on a specific problem set and issue set. So maybe it doesn't typically holistically look at things, and so maybe that's a good point. So finding ways to have these institutions collaborate better is probably a good way going forward. But again, all institutions can improve, all institutions can get better, all institutions can be more diverse, all institutions can be more welcoming of new voices. I think all of these institutions probably have some work to do in terms of gender equality and things like that. But I think they each serve their own role. So I don't see them changing much, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Barry?
Yeah, I agree with everything Fiona said. I'd like to add that I don't see a major shift coming up. I think the core internet protocols will continue to be developed by technical people making technical decisions that are independent of what country they're from and largely independent, or at least to some extent independent of the companies they work for. There's a place, as Fiona said, for government input, for input from a country point of view. And I think that's important. I think we need to look at that. There's essentially none of that input directly into the IETF. And so that's where ITUT comes in. And ISO, which is another international standards organization that's country-based. And among the different standards development organizations, there is a basic understanding of what the scope of that organization is and who owns, if you will, the protocols that they're working on. So the agreements, the understanding is that the IETF works on the basic protocols for routing and internet protocol, and the TCP, the transport protocols, and a certain set of application layer protocols and security. Other organizations such as W3C work on other pieces. ITUT works on the pieces. It does 3GPP, does the mobile protocols. And those understandings generally work. And we have liaison relationships going back and forth among the organizations to try to keep that in place and try to keep us from doing duplicated work, keep us from doing conflicting work. And where there are conflicts, we get them resolved through that process. So I think we'll continue to see that. And I think it is important to have the input from the techies, from the governments, from the practical, the operators who actually have to deploy this stuff. But in the end, there's no global internet police that says these are the protocols, you have to do it this way. And if some locality says we adopt this standard and encourage everyone in our country to do this, and we don't like that standard, you are not allowed to do that in our country. That's the way it works, and we can't control that at a micro level.
We had a question in the chat from the audience, which is related exactly to that point, and also to what Fiona mentioned before about the role of governments. And apparently there's in the OMC on commerce that there's a rule that it's called Lex Marcatoria. I didn't know about that, but apparently it's how each country can have its own regulation and things that are kept internal to each country. So do you foresee something similar, or is it something that can be applied? Do you foresee something on those lines where each country starts having their own rules?
Well, for my part, I expect that managing that sort of thing is going to be relatively unusual, that we're relatively going to have the internet that behaves the same everywhere. And there will be pockets of differences rather than vast differences from country to country. I think the differences will continue to stay fairly small, with relatively few countries doing significant restrictions. That's what tends to keep the internet operating as smoothly as it does. If we started having every country making legislation that restricted things, that changed how the internet works, I think we would have a lot more difficulty with an open and resilient internet than we have. But I don't see that happening.
But so for both of you, don't you think that when you open that door, things can go into evolve on very difficult on a path that is going, or a trend that is going to be difficult to revert?
I think it's possible, but I think for the most part, everyone understands that the internet works best when that doesn't happen. And the internet is so important to all of our societies now. Both the people and the governments rely on the internet to such an extent that it's not in the best interest of most countries to destabilize that. And I think everyone understands that. Again, there's no global police. There's no alien beings out orbiting us that are monitoring this and making things work. We have to do it by cooperation and collaboration. And so far that's worked, and I think it will continue to for the most part.
Fiona, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Barry that that's what history has shown. I think we're at an interesting inflection point in history that I'm not convinced that it's 100% going to continue going that way. And even over the last 20 or 30 years, if you look at sort of the history of the internet's development, there have always been these tensions about what individual governments wanted to do or policy objectives of a government or a collection of governments, and how the openness of the internet may have clashed with that. So I don't necessarily think that it's assured that the policymakers and regulators and politicians see the world the way that Barry is described as an engineer. It would be much easier for all of us if they did, but I do think that they often don't. And I think policymakers and legislators or governments, they tend to regulate values, right? Values of your country or your region, which is their job. And in doing that, often they can make rules that undermine what they're trying to achieve technologically. I think, the European Union's efforts on GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and, the importance of privacy as a sort of a fundamental human right in Europe, and important for them to regulate and legislate GDPR. Well, there are some knock-on effects to GDPR in terms of innovation, in terms of data collection, on the domain name system, the who is debate, rages on. And also in the sense of, AI innovation. If data can't flow, the AI is only as good as the data flows. So there, I think it's obvious to me that friends and colleagues in Europe want good technology and they want innovation and they want all these things, but they've put a law into place that's becoming sort of a de facto global standard that's going to run counter to that, right? And so there's an example, just one. I mean, even the China new IP proposal, which has evolved since it was originally submitted. I can't speak to what the intent of that proposal was, but when I read it, it sort of triggered a lot of things in me that, well, this is kind of much more of a top-down approach to developing things. It's an opportunity or an appearance of trying to put governments back in control of things. For 5G and satellite broadband, it creates additional barriers to deployment. I think that the way that it's written, they're suggesting, no, we want to deal with limits, but the way that I see it in terms of how it would be implemented, the consequence would be the opposite. Same thing on the internet governance and domain name piece of that proposal. It would kind of upend the current multi-stakeholder approach to how you develop domain name policy. So again, there could be a lot of good intent in putting forward the conversation, but the implementation and how things would go forward on the ground would definitely change things. So it would be amazing if policymakers and regulators and politicians understood all the technology that internet engineers do and understood the design and how that would work. The reality is that they don't. So I think, I do think we're definitely at there's, when I look at this sort of internet governance, security, policy debate around the world, it's sort of cyclical for me and kind of goes up and down. And I feel like we're at another inflection point when the internet's never been more important as it is today in terms of what we've seen with COVID and everyone needing to be online and your whole life moving online. At the same time, all the problems of society have followed online, whether it's disinformation, whether it's security challenges, all of those things, and governments feel the need to address them. And I'm not convinced that governments will address them in a way that won't disrupt the global nature of the network. So I think a lot's to be seen in the next 3 or 4 years on that.
Yeah, so I wanted to add something about GDPR. That's a very good point you had, Fiona. And I look at GDPR as a response to the amazing way the internet has eroded our privacy as a society, that everybody is starting to live their lives online in the open, exposed to everything. And this is sort of a backlash of that, well, let's see how we can rein this in, how we can give people the opportunity, at least, to have their privacy back. It will be interesting to see how that evolves over the next years, because my perception from how I look at it is that the younger people are, I mean, you see I have the gray beard. I'm from the days when you kept things private, but people in their 20s they largely don't see this as a problem. They see this as a benefit, that they can be public about everything, and they're just taking a different approach to it. So it'll be interesting to me to see how things like GDPR evolve over the years as the youth becomes middle-aged and older and starts being the ones who make these regulations. But I agree that GDPR has really thrown a wrench into a lot of this, making us change how we do things, how we record things, how long we keep information, and what we do with it. Personally, I favor it, but I can certainly see how it's made a lot of policy problems for countries who are outside the scope of GDPR and yet still have to deal with it. There's no longer local regulation in that area. What Europe decides affects everybody.
So there's a lot of interest from the audience on the previous discussion on the role of governments and in particular with new technologies and 5G. And I'm going to combine some of those questions. The influence of some of those technologies, including 5G, on this trend on having digital curtains, on mixing geopolitical issues like the US versus China. So the question would be, aren't all those new technologies enforcing that issue that we have nowadays and that is fragmenting the internet? So isn't it a clear trend? I combined several questions in one. So
I'm not sure I really followed the question, Christian.
Yes, probably the reason is that I mixed some of them. So one of them is regarding 5G and your views on if there's going to be a digital curtain, a digital iron curtain, I would say isolation of countries on the internet, and technologies such as 5G are going to enforce or facilitate those digital iron curtains. That's one question. And then the impact of those on this 5G race or implementations, and how does it affect countries and what it means for other countries outside the US and China. And there are others, but let's try to address those first. So 5G and the impact on the digital iron curtain, and also the impact on other countries. Do you see a connection?
I'm not sure that I see 5G making that any different. We already see, for instance, what we call the Great Firewall of China, and we've seen other countries blocking parts, all or part of the internet. We've seen cases where countries cut themselves off completely for a while from the internet for internal reasons, and whether they do that through IP or through 5G or whatever mechanism, as I said before, I think it's going to be a small minority of countries who do that at a significant level. I think we'll continue to see countries doing it at a smaller level for local reasons, blocking pornography, for instance, in a country for which that's very sensitive, and other countries for which it's less sensitive, allowing it. We certainly see that. On the large scale, I think it's going to be a relative handful of countries who will do it. For again, maybe it's just my engineer point of view, but again, the idea that the internet is sufficiently important to the society and to the government that wholesale blocking at a large scale is going to be detrimental to any society. And increasingly so over time as we become more dependent on it for our social aspects and our business aspects. So I don't see 5G as making it better or worse.
Thank you, Barry. We are running out of time, but I would like to address a last question, and it's connected to the how infrastructure and protocols are important for nation states, and how does that going to influence the role of ICANN and IETF, and I guess the overall internet governance framework or model. And do you think this is going to impact the current internet governance situation? Is it going to affect how we discuss or agree on resource allocations and the work that ICANN and others are doing? Probably, Fiona, you addressed part of that in your introduction.
Sure. I think, just like technology and protocols are always evolving, these institutions are always evolving. So ICANN's not supposed to be a static institution. It's changed a lot in the 20 years of its history. So I think there's a place for all stakeholders to participate in ICANN. Governments have an opportunity and a strong voice and an opportunity to shape decisions and have a unique role in the ICANN system through the Governmental Advisory Committee, where if they give consensus advice to the board, it triggers a particular set of requirements that no other stakeholder group has. So you're always going to have places to participate. In the IETF world, the rules of participation there is you participate as an individual stakeholder, not representing your institution. But the U.S. government does heavily participate in all the different parts of the IETF. It's just people don't have a flag that says, U.S. government. And I think if you were to sort of look at the spectrum of a UN system where I might sit behind a flag that says U.S. government, where I go to an ICANN meeting, where I go to the GAC room, where there are no government flags, but people know I'm the U.S. government. And then you go to an IETF meeting where you're participating as a technical expert, where someone might know where you work, but there's a sort of a scale of where people think being in government influences what you're doing or how you're doing. So I don't see that changing at all going forward, but always evolving, right? That's the point of this system. On your last question, maybe just briefly on sort of the 5G conversation, I don't think I agree with Barry. I don't think it changes sort of what he's called the Iron Curtain or the Great Firewall of China in terms of, and other countries replicating that. What I think is a little bit interesting and a little bit different with sort of 5G is, there are obviously clear visions of how technology should be developed or governed and managed, right? There's sort of a developed world, Western world, US-based approach. The European approach is slightly different. Brazilian approach is slightly different. And the Chinese and Russian approach is equally different. And I think what you're seeing in the 5G space, and which is a very public conversation now, is that you have a country like China that has indigenous companies like a Huawei or ZTE and others that are big players in the market. And, you see a very focused government approach to help them build that market and expand abroad. And I think that's a little different than what we've seen in the past in some of these debates. The US historically has been technology neutral and not favored one company over another, and Europeans have done a slightly different approach as well. So that's why I think it's getting a bigger play, and people see it as having more of a concern. You also have seen with the sort of aggressive is the wrong word, but more vocal and more pointed engagement by China. You've seen a bigger and more direct response from the United States, right? And so that's where you see some of those tensions continue to play. And I think it will continue to play out on the 5G supply chain issues. That issue is not going away anytime soon, and I think will actually only intensify.
We are getting into the most important discussion, I think, but unfortunately we run out of time. So I guess we will see this conversation following up on other debates or media. So thank you very much. Luis, I don't know if you would like to say some closing words, but I think that we are finishing.
Olá, Christian, muito obrigada pelo debate. Barry Leiba e Fiona também. Foi um prazer recebê-los aqui. A gente tem uma última pergunta da audiência que chegou agora, eu vou encaminhar para vocês, e aí a gente pode encerrar. Aqui no Brasil, o assunto do 5G virou um cabo de guerra contra a China e outros países, né? Como lidar com a politização do 5G? Se os três quiserem comentar sobre a pergunta.
Padronização? Como foi a última parte?
Politização.
Politização, okay. So we've got one more question, so probably we have a few minutes, a few more minutes. So there's a huge debate in Brazil regarding 5G, and how do you see the connection with politics? Probably you might not be aware of all the details in Brazil, but the question would be, so this debate on the US and China, it's affecting other countries, and this is the case for Brazil. So how do you see that debate impacting the local policy discussions, because they are? So do you foresee new issues arise, or do you think that countries are going to align behind one of those two positions, or how do you think it's going to influence the local discussions?
So I'm happy to go first on this one. So I think that, obviously the debate and sort of the disagreements between the US and China on 5G and supply chain and 5G equipment obviously impacts other countries as they face the same conversations and face the same questions that the United States did about what to allow into your country, what do you think is secure, what do you think is not secure, and every nation state and every government has to sort of make the choice that works best for them in their environment. I will say, as a former U.S. government official and understanding the positions that were taken in the previous administration, one of the biggest concerns that we had expressed to people at the time was, concerns about buying equipment from companies that are required under their national law to give all data if it's asked to their government. Now, I know that in Brazil, there's a lot of consternation and concern, and there were lots of issues about the Snowden disclosures. So that people can be a little bit like, oh, it's the United States, really? How can you say those things? So the one thing I would say, though, is that in the United States, we do have rule of law. We do have an independent court system. If a company is asked to give data or asked to comply or asked to provide something to law enforcement in the United States, it's clearly spelled out in our legal regime. And there's a way for them to object and a way for them to go through a court system to adjudicate those disputes. In a country like China that doesn't have an independence of a court system and doesn't have the same sort of best practices of global rule of law, there is no way to object. So if you buy equipment from a company or you buy facilities or capabilities from a country that has to comply with their own domestic law, right? Everybody does. And their domestic law, which is what the Chinese cybersecurity law says, which is if we ask you for the data, you must give it to us. That's something I think that people should give a lot of thought to. And I think that was one of the things that the previous administration and the current administration, I presume, will go around and sort of make that point to people, which is it in your national interest and in your national security interest to allow data to go back to another country, regardless of what your local laws are. And for countries that are particularly concerned about data privacy and data protection, like I know in Brazil, it's a very difficult issue. And you've seen how Europe has handled that, and Europe over the last 3 or 4 years has shifted their approach. The European Commission developed, I think, a risk framework to examine and kind of look at these issues, but then individual countries have gone the similar path. It's very unusual, I will say, for the United States to have done what it's done to outright ban equipment. That's not the typical US approach, but it is something that people came to, decision makers, for some of the reasons I've just laid out.
So let me ask a clarifying question. Luisa, do we have more time, or because I do have 2 different schedules for can we proceed?
Yes.
Oh, that's great news. Yes, excellent. So let me then continue this debate. And also connected with this, the impact of these new technologies and trends. I've got a question for Barry. You mentioned that new IP, it's an unfortunate name and more like a marketing name and not a protocol or technical term. But there's also a concern with the process and where the discussions take place and where it was presented and how open are those discussions and what are the influence of the different stakeholders on it. So, and you mentioned that there are clear areas of discussion, like the details are going to be discussed in the ITF or among the technical people, and probably the overall discussion is going to take place in the ITU. But how do you foresee this discussion evolve? Are there going to be joint groups? Is the ITU marketing discussion going to disappear eventually, and the real work is going to take place in the ITF? Both of them are going to proceed in parallel. How do you foresee that evolution?
Well, I guess there's 2 pieces to that. There's what I foresee and what I would like to see. And they're not quite the same thing. What I would like to see is I think it's time in the discussion that's already happened for the discussion to move into the IETF context. I think now is the right time. Because we still have to get past the resistance that's been built up through the media, what the media has reported, the name and the reports that have come from the media that China wants to redesign the internet and things like that. And that's causing friction that makes it difficult to bring the conversation in. The other thing that makes it difficult to bring the conversation, I need to slow down a little bit, that makes it difficult to bring the conversation into the IETF is the fact that it's still a very broad topic and it hasn't gotten down into details and specific proposals yet. But there's always been a balance that if we wait too long to bring the discussion into the IETF, then it looks like we've narrowed things down too much and the IETF doesn't have enough input into how the pieces are broken out. If we do it too early, then the IETF finds it too much of a big blob that's amorphous and does not have enough focus to bring to the IETF. But so now or soon is the time to bring that over. I think what's actually going to happen is the discussion will continue in parallel for a while. But it's quite clear to me that the actual protocol proposals are going to come to the IETF, and that ITUT does not intend to work on a new IP protocol. And I think that's the right answer, that the protocol proposals will come to the IETF and need to. So that's my thought on that.
Fiona, would you like to add something? Because I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure. I would just say that the scope of this original document as it was submitted into the ITUT was really broad, right? And the idea was that the network needed to expand and you needed to deal with some deficiencies. But in doing so, the proposal sweeps in not just traditional internet broadband networks, but it also brought in, new 5G networks. It also brought in satellite broadband. And neither of those last two topics are things that get discussed in the IETF in terms of standards making. So I think it's going to be very challenging to kind of move this proposal forward. And like I said, when I read the document, there were some big picture problems that I saw. So for 5G and satellite broadband, you're creating additional barriers to terrestrial and space-based 5G deployment. You're establishing tighter governmental controls over provisioning and identity, which means delays in implementations for satellite and space-based operations. And it complicates the application of current regulation and just that set of issues. And then in terms of the topics that would traditionally go into IETF land, it sort of upended multi-stakeholder governance of the DNS. There was the suggestion where you could take away the implication that you wanted to replace the existing DNS or fracture the root. And then you were going to create these sort of non-interoperable network islands that were then going to have to be interconnected later on. So I think I agree with Barry, it's probably not going away as a topic of conversation in lots of different places. But I think the original proposal is so big in nature and so broad in scope, you sort of trigger poor or unfavorable reactions from people across a big spectrum of technology, not just the traditional internet governance space.
Well, I'll add to that the internet has always been a set of interconnected networks, hence the name. And so the idea that we will have these, as you say, non-interoperable islands that are put together as an internet has always been the case. And I agree that one way of building this future system may involve having pieces of smaller networks that have new protocols that resolve some of the issues that these use cases bring up. That will then connect to the internet and use the standard internet protocols at that layer. One example is one of the use cases involves extremely low latency and extremely reliable communication that might not be possible over the open internet in general, but would be acceptable in a contained network of, say, a vehicle-to-vehicle network where the instant transmission of vehicle status is critical, or in a medical situation where there are life and death issues that require that these communications be fast and reliable and that sort of thing. And then those islands connect to the internet for the broader communication needs.
So I have a follow-up question for both of you because as I understand, the marketing term for new IP is something that is so broad that impacts the whole internet, but in practical or how's it going to happen? It's going to be like islands of service or particular use cases or things that are going to evolve eventually to address specific things. And that's what the IETF does. It's been happening for a long time so far. There are new technologies and protocols and services discussed that address specific needs. So apparently, there's no new as an evolution for the whole internet topic, but the usual evolution of individual services and applications that are going to address specific needs. If that's the case, then there's no new IP or no new nothing, because it's going to be the same trend. Did I understand correctly, Barry, or am I missing something?
Well, I think once we finish the gap analysis and decide what's missing in the existing protocols to support the use cases we're talking about, we will have a better idea of what needs to be proposed to fill those gaps. And depending on what the answer to that is, we may indeed have a case where for some island, some special case network that supports a certain use case, there will have to be some basic protocols that are redesigned. That doesn't mean that will cause the internet protocols as a whole to change that drastically, but there may be new protocols that are developed for this special case network to support the features that are needed for this use case. And that's what I'm trying to get at with, I don't know, am I making myself clear on that? And does that answer your question?
Yes, but if that's the case, and there are things that require a big change affecting, I would say, the majority of the hosts or devices on the net, that's a huge endeavor, and things like IPv6 took 20 years to really be deployed and changed. So if there are certain things that need to be changed that affect the entire internet, don't you think that because of our previous experience, that's going to be extremely difficult to get? Because in the past we had the pressure or the need because of the lack of IPv4 addresses, but now it's going to be difficult to have a real need and convince all the users and hosts.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't foresee the need to make that basic a change to the global internet. If a change at that level is needed, I think it will be in a contained portion of the network that will interface with the internet as a whole. So I think the changes that would be made to the internet protocols globally would be extensions and enhancements that would support the interconnections from these other networks.
Sorry, yes, so I got it right in the first place, so thank you. So Fiona, would you like to add something? I think that we can wrap up and say our final remarks, if you will.
Sure, I would just add on this topic in terms of network islands and gap analysis and issue-specific stuff. Look, you have to always, maybe it's a little bit cynical, but you always have to be conscious of where conversations take place. And having a conversation on a gap analysis in an institution where governments have the final say, governments, just like other people, are opportunistic, and they'll try to take technical standards and get their policy objectives embedded in those. And I think there will be these trade-offs and challenges, even in these gap analysis, of countries that have different approaches to the internet than the United States or other countries like Brazil may have had over the years, and countries that are looking to have more pervasive surveillance or government control. And I think that's going to continue to filter through the conversation of new IP, or it's whatever it's called afterwards, wherever it's going to be. So I think people have to be vigilant, and you have to pay attention, and you have to participate. And that's why having the conversation in a place where you can participate is better than in a place where participation is gated. And that is the challenge of the ITU on that one. So.
Indeed. And that's why I think I want to see this conversation move to the IETF, or at least part of it move to the IETF as soon as possible, for exactly the reason Fiona just said. And I think there will be parallel conversations going on for a while.
Thank you very much, both. I think at least in my case, it was extremely clarifying, and I'm glad to see some agreement on the trend and how is it going to evolve. And in that case, it's going to be aligned with the current internet, open internet processes and way the debates and how the multiple stakeholders participate in those discussions. So glad to hear that. And with that, I think we can finish our session. Luisa or someone from NIC.br would like to say the final remarks? Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Christian, obrigada, Barry e Fiona, pela participação de vocês. Foi um debate super importante para a gente aprofundar o debate sobre o futuro da governança da internet. A gente agradece muito a presença de vocês.
Muito obrigado.